Did you guys hear that? It just said the meeting's being recorded. Buzzkill. All right, everybody. Number 34, the Rose and Rhetoric podcast. Joining me as always, my charming co-host.
Jose Cuervo.
4 underscores between those two words. So, a very exciting episode today. We'll begin our discussion. Of course, we're only ever beginning the discussion in some sense of The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. A great book, a book that I enjoyed that I think Joe's enjoying as well. This book kind of has something like a cult following, I would say. Definitely a book that's become popular and seems to have a lot of impact on people that have read it. So Joe and I will be talking about that book a little bit today. We plan on doing a number of episodes about this book, covering a little bit of it every single time. And along the way, I think combining or rather connecting some of the ideas in this book to some of the ideas we've talked about on our previous episodes. But Joe, before we get to that, as always, we must begin with a recap of your week.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's been a little bit of a cloudy and rainy week in Portland. The Blazers are down 2-1 in the playoffs right now, which is also kind of a bummer.
Right.
But I managed to escape the cloudy Portland, Oregon for Leavenworth, Washington.
Sunny Washington State.
Sunny Washington State. Drove in late last night, and I'll be here for the weekend.
How far are you from Portland?
It's about a 5-hour drive.
Okay, so the weather can be pretty different between the two locations.
Yeah, it's definitely more dry here, less cloudy, more sunny. It's nice. I recommend it. I haven't had a chance to explore because I just got here last night and I had to set up for the podcast this morning. But
absolutely,
maybe next week I'll have a better review of Leavenworth.
I had never been to Washington State, and it's on my list of places to go. We'll see. One day I'll get out there. I want to go to like Seattle and Portland, and I've been to Portland before. I visited you there one time.
That's true.
I will say Portland lives up to the reputation. If you like it, you'll like it. If you don't like it, you won't like it. But I thought it was a fun time. Yeah, it was true to its colors, mostly white. No, it was a fun place to go, fun place to visit, and that was when I fell out the back of a U-Haul, busted my knee open. That was a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, that's a big fall.
Yeah,
that was like a 3-foot fall.
What I'll say about U-Hauls is this: one, and Joe, I know you'll agree with me on this. You definitely want to get that rebate. You definitely want to get the gasoline rebate. And I'll tell you something else. They're going to point out that rebate about 10 times during the rental procedure. So they're telling you you want to get that rebate. And they're not lying to you. You want to get that gasoline rebate, 100%.
And another lesson I learned from U-Haul is that if you ever get a parking ticket in a U-Haul, despite popular belief, you actually do have to pay it. You can't just pretend like it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah, it's not good. The fees just get higher.
It just gets higher. And that's a good phenomena. You know, Joe, when we were growing up a little bit younger, these answer websites, Quora, Yahoo Answers, whatever, normally the problem-solving procedure went something like the following. Encounter an adverse situation, go to one of these websites and scroll until you found the answer that you liked.
Yep.
And then convince yourself that's the right answer. That's normally what problem solving means, right?
That's still how I solve the majority of my problems.
Absolutely.
Just keep scrolling until you find what you want to hear.
Yeah. And then that becomes what you do. And the process repeats itself. And normally works out, but sometimes when it comes to legal fees, et cetera, not the best course of action.
Yeah, it's a process. It's always improving.
Yeah. Well, that sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing about Washington State next episode. Looks like a beautiful place. I'd like to get up there one time. I had a couple of things I wanted to open up with before we get to BOI, and I think it's things that our audience wants to hear about. First off, I think all of us have been trolled majorly for our whole lives with something that I realized yesterday. And it's in these PDF documents of books that you might find online. Occasionally you'll find a PDF page that says something to the following of, this page intentionally left blank. It's a troll because the page is not blank. The words are on the page. They're telling you the page is blank. It's actually not blank. I realized this last night, got some good feedback from it, and I wanted to make that known to our audience that we have been trolled forever, how many years, by the PDF community, reading that over and over again. Kind of like a slap in the face, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, why not just leave the page truly blank?
something to write on. I mean, I don't know why they don't do that either.
Or say this page is intentionally almost left blank.
Yes, this page is intentionally mostly blank.
Yes.
Would be appropriate. The second thing I realized, and I don't say this lightly, but I have to call out Jake from State Farm. And I don't like doing this. I really don't like doing this, but I have to do this. On a number of commercials I've seen with Jake from State Farm, or rather I should say, his customers are under the impression that he gave them some kind of special deal, and they try to pay him back in some way. We've all seen these, the Maya markdown, the Parker promo, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
As best I can tell, Jake never gives these gifts back to the customers before the commercial ends. He's keeping these gifts. Now, he explains to them that there is, in fact, no special pricing given to these people, but he still keeps the gift. And I don't like that. I think Jake should be more deliberate in giving these gifts back to those people who were clearly misguided when they gave them to him in the first place.
Right. They gave it to him under a false premise, right?
Yes. And he keeps it. So I would like to see a series of commercials from State Farm where Jake goes to these people and he gives him back the gifts that he received in full and explains to them, as he does in the commercial, there is no markdown, but making them understand it and then requiring that they take back the gifts. I think until that happens, State Farm, I'm a little uneasy with right now. I have to be honest with you. I'm a little uneasy with State Farm at the moment.
Sounds like we have some tweets coming out towards State Farm.
Well, if they don't get their act together, I don't see what choice I have. I'm not going to remain quiet as this injustice perpetuates on the airwaves. So I think it requires some vigilance, and I will be the voice of reason as always.
The vigilante.
And okay. Well, those things out of the way, Joe, let's hop into the meat of this episode. Let's hop into the meat of what we're talking about today. We're talking today about the beginning of infinity. Again, a book by David Deutsch, scientist, philosopher. That's the one. And here at another book that we may get to at some point called The Fabric of Reality. That also was pretty interesting as well. But this book is much more about the nature of human progress. And I think I have read the book. Joe's reading it right now. I will say, I think this is a book people should definitely buy, definitely read. And so we're going to spend the next few episodes kind of going over parts of this book and explaining the parts in the book, but also trying to connect that to why it's important, why it matters, et cetera, et cetera. So Joe, I thought we would start with you. I know that you've been doing some diligent note taking with these books. Let's open it up so far with your impressions so far and some of the key ideas I stick at you right away at the beginning part of the book that you so far have covered.
Sure. So I'm 3 chapters deep at this point, and I mean the book it's dense, but it's interesting. It's not like a textbook in the sense that it's a drag to read it and you're like falling asleep as you go through it. But it is have a lot of information, a lot of new ways of looking at things. And just a few notes here from the first few chapters. He came up with this idea, or he talks about this concept of fabulism, which is one that I've been thinking about. And fabulism is essentially that there are no authoritative sources of knowledge, nor any reliable means of justifying ideas as being true or probable. So I think this applies a lot to our lives and throughout humanity. Like back in the day, people would there would be a new religion that came out, like a new mythology, like a Greek mythology that would just state something. And then this church now becomes this authority figure that provides knowledge for everyone in the system. And we essentially just reiterated that process throughout history. Like it used to be religion or these mythology back in the day. And now we're starting to have new authoritative figures. Specifically, I think that science is becoming one of those authoritative figures. And I say science because science in the true sense is like actually good and helpful at getting knowledge. But I think that in today's society, we have turned science into this form of propaganda where, if you're not for science, you're against it. If you don't believe the science as some journalist states it, then you're anti-science. And this concept of science and this idea of science has become this authority figure. And I think that a lot of people are falling for that. And especially like when we talked with Jacob Stiganga, he brought to light the importance of how most scientific studies aren't even reproducible. In fact, like less than 50% of them are. So to say that a study says this and this is science, I mean, there's a 50% chance that could be wrong. So I really like this concept of fableism. And I really like how David Deutsch, in this case, linked that to a phrase or a motto that was used by the Royal Society, which is nullius in verba, which means take no one's word for it. And again, I think this really just reinforces this idea of not believing what other people say and only getting your knowledge from internally, from what you see, from what you hear, from what your senses provide you. And I think that's important for today's society and living in today's world. What do you think about that?
So I would say the last part about our senses, that would be empiricism, which is what he argues against in the first chapter as well. I think
that's fair.
Where he ends up getting with science is this idea that it's a process that we use to generate good explanations, and we can define kind of the criteria for a good explanation, and that at some level every explanation will have shortcomings, but that it can improve upon the previous explanation by capturing the same ability to describe the data that existed before, and then also to encapsulate whatever shortcoming the previous idea had. And so you went from Newtonian mechanics to relativity by in a sense, not by just adding to Newton's idea, but replacing it entirely with a better idea. And the reason you would say that the idea is better is because it's able to account for the phenomena that Newton was able to describe, but also the phenomena that Newton was unable to describe. And so we have a process by producing good explanations with conjecture. We create ideas that are hard to vary without changing, in a sense, the predictions of the conjecture. And then we measure that conjecture to some form of criticism.
Why don't you describe what conjecture is?
So conjecture is just, I would say, formulating an idea, and then testing that idea out in the world to determine how well it corresponds with reality as it exists. And so an important idea with David Deutsch is the idea of realism, which kind of simply is the idea that there is a real world that we are interacting with. And as a result, when we form ideas about what that world is, we have some way of actually measuring and determining, do our ideas correspond with what we're observing? And I think this is an important idea for people to have, because there's maybe a notion that, and David talks about this as well, that science is just the idea of improving predictions, and that there's a quote in one of the chapters about how science is in the process of just chasing decimals for some prediction that we have. And what David says is actually, no, that's not what science is. Science is about forming new ideas that in some cases are radically different than the ideas that are before them. Quantum mechanics is radically different than Newtonian mechanics, and relativity is radically different than Newtonian mechanics as well. And so it isn't just that you're able to produce more decimals for whatever prediction you're having. That is true. Relativity does make better predictions than Newtonian mechanics. But what makes it a new idea is not only does it make better, or let me say a better idea, it's not only that it makes better predictions, but that it replaces, in a sense, the shortcomings of Newton's idea. That is a different kind of criticism. It isn't just calculating some kind of calculation procedures. It's criticizing the idea. It is making a statement about the universe as it exists that is fundamentally different than the framework that Newton described. And the same would be true of Schrödinger, when and other people that were involved with QM at the beginning. They were making statements about the world that were different ideas than Newton. It wasn't just making a more precise measurement or adding some kind of correction factor. It was a radically different idea. And so from that perspective, we have an idea that science is not some kind of procedural way of measuring data and fitting lines to data, but it is about forming ideas about the universe. And then the process of science is improving upon those ideas through criticism. So I found that to be really a very good way of describing science in a way that I think people understand. And in a way, it's a very human explanation, because when we think about what people do, we think about people being creative, about people thinking. we're not just robots measuring little data points, but we're forming ideas in our head, and then we are in a sense putting those ideas out into the world in order to determine how they correspond with reality.
Yeah, like the true science, there's a base level of creativity needed in order to advance it. And
Right. Which is a critique of the idea of inductionism, that
yes.
how do we form ideas? Well, we start with some sample of measurements and then we somehow generalize. And David says, in fact, that's not what we do. What we do is we form ideas. Of course, the data informs the ideas that we form. We don't just ignore data. That would be silly. But in fact, what we're doing as humans is we are seeking better explanations. We are forming ideas that are better than the ones before them. And in cases such as, again, relativity and QM, are radically different than the ideas proposed by Newton. And in fact, I should just say as well, I mean, quantum mechanics, relativity are also different from each other. They make radically different statements about the universe as well. And in fact, that comes into play later on in the book when he talks about the multiverse, which I don't feel like getting into. I couldn't get into. I don't understand anything about it. But it is important to understand that, again, it's the idea that you're replacing an idea with a better idea is an idea about science that isn't, I think, often stressed enough, and that David very much forces out to say, like, this is what science is. And
Yes.
I think it leaves interesting points later on in the book.
And I like David Deutsch's definition of science, or his idea of it. But what I'm saying is that I think it's different than what we're using it as today. Like
Right.
his definition of science is it needs to be testable. It has to be, which is a defining characteristic of the scientific method.
Yeah.
And I think nowadays we've just bastardized that term science so much to the point that we need to use fatalism as we look at it. Like, look at social sciences. Like, these aren't really real sciences. They're not really testable. Like, a lot of psychology is not testable. A lot of some of these things, political science, not super testable. And people just treat it as dogma. And I think that's what we need to be careful of. But
I agree.
And as David Deutsch has described it,
yeah,
is a valid one. And I really like that one.
And I think to add on to what you just said about what makes those other sciences hard is that it's hard to form an idea in those fields that's hard to make invariable. That when you make a prediction or a theory in physics, you can be very precise in how you define what the theory is saying. And so in a sense, you commit yourself to some kind of statement, basically. He gives the example of why is mythology not a good explanation? Well, because you have all these extra characteristics in it that you could change. It's, does the god have long hair or short hair? Is he blue eyes or red eyes? I mean, you have all these variables you could change. In a good explanation, you don't have those kind of things. You have a very limited set of statements or variables or whatever you want to call it. And if you were to change any one of those even slightly, you would expect a totally different outcome. That would then be, in a sense, a different idea that you would have to test.
And I'm glad you mentioned the mythology, because that was another topic in chapter 3, the anthropocentric.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm saying that right. Anthropocentric point of view, which means that it's centered on human beings and more broadly on people. So this is where you start getting explanations that involve entities with intentions and human-like characteristics, like spirits and gods, like Greek mythology and that type of thing. And how this was just a major fallacy of how humans would obtain knowledge for a big part of human history up until the Enlightenment period. And yeah, I mean, and part of the Enlightenment was taking that anthropocentric point of view and then factoring in knowledge that's expressed entirely in terms of impersonal entities, like in terms of like numbers or geometry or shapes. And Euclid was a big pioneer in that field, as David Deutsch describes it. And I mean, it seems obvious now, like, why would we assume our knowledge comes from like made up creatures that are kind of like us, that are like superhuman immortals, as opposed to some of these like more reliable, like apathetic concepts like geometry.
Right. And, again, the idea that when you have a mythology as your basis, how would you really go about testing it? That's always the question too. It's so you're saying that there's a deity that's mad at you because you did something. How do you know that they're mad at you? Maybe they're happy that you did something. I mean, there's just all these ways of there's no there's no way of pegging down the explanation to a specific test. When Newton says, this is the law of gravity, this is what it is, you can go and measure it. And it's an equation that's precise. And either that equation is true or it is wrong, but it's definitive. There's no subjectivity. There's no, well, maybe it was a bad day for gravity. It was feeling kind of tired. There's no way to wiggle out of it. It's either true or it's wrong. And so you get tied into a specific prediction, into a specific statement about reality that can then be checked. And one of the things that makes mythology bad is that there's too many, however many characters, and there's just always ways of varying the characters. And it's unclear how you would really go about testing any of those, because there's too many things to change. It's unnecessary in a sense to explain the world.
I think he used the example of the seasons, I think,
Right.
and how, through Greek mythology, like some Greek god, like depending how the god felt, I think during a certain part of the year, like someone had to go down to Hades, and during another part, someone didn't, and that's what controlled the seasons on the earth. And like you said, you can't test it. So it's by nature that's a bad explanation, because you can't test it.
Well, one thing that I liked about that part, and what was interesting, is it's interesting to think how we are connected to our heritage as humans, because even though the Greeks were putting around in the mythology sense bad explanations, it's interesting that they were trying to explain it. In other words, the idea that they thought, here is a phenomenon that's happening that we need to explain, is an interesting idea in and of itself. Like my dog, I don't think really feels need to explain anything. It's the food comes out, the water is there, it goes around. It doesn't really need to explain anything. Humans, even though we've made bad explanations, that we have this instinct for trying to understand things is a point that is I think central to the point that David Deutsch is making. But we can see it throughout history, and we can see how that process has itself evolved from mythology to science. But it was always there in some form. This need to actually, I don't want to just understand that the seasons change. I want to know why they change. And that drive to me is interesting to think about. And we see examples of it in mythology and other religions, that is what that is. It's we're trying to ask why, and which I think is in some sense always a noble, pursuit, basically. And it's interesting that we've been doing it, I guess, for as long as we've been human. I mean,
I think that David Deutsch would applaud that use of conjecture, if you could call it that. I think you could, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a explanation for something.
Yeah.
I think he would criticize it because, like you said, it's not testable. And he also talked about how this concept of the principle of mediocrity.
Yeah.
And how that ties into this anthropocentric point of view, where back in the day before the Enlightenment, everyone thought that humans were super important, so all their conjectured beliefs were based around that. But now it seems like the leading theory is that humans really aren't that significant in the grand scheme of things. I think at one point he called it like chemical scum on the Earth's surface.
Right. Which to his point, I think he was actually, in a sense, challenging that mindset, that there is something special about people in our ability to be constructors, that is, in a sense, our ability to conjecture and criticize. We are, in a sense, we are special, and we are different than other animals. Again, like my dog isn't going around thinking about the shortcomings of Newtonian mechanics or something like that. And so the sense that our planet is mediocre and that our sun is mediocre and all those other things, I think, are definitely true. But in a point that David makes, I think, is actually kind of an inspiring message, is that if we're willing to pay attention to what people actually are, we are special. Why are we special? Because our ability to be universal constructors, our ability to use knowledge to achieve, in theory, anything that is allowed by the laws of physics. That is something that is special. A star cannot do that. A rock cannot do that. A dog cannot do that. A person can. So it is different, and it's important to remember that we're different, because I feel that sometimes is missed. And I think the principle of mediocrity, I agree with David here, I think sometimes goes too far in describing people as just being another animal. You're not another animal. We are animals, but we are a special kind, a universal constructor that has this ability that is worth remembering and worth thinking about.
Yeah, to go along with that, another example that he gave was of how like humans are impactful in the universe.
Yeah,
he was talking about how just out in space, like in the very thinnest parts of the outer universe where there's like nothing, like the temperature really, because there's so much background radiation in the universe that you
Right.
can't really get below a certain temperature.
Mhm.
Like absolute zero is like negative 273 Celsius, but the universe itself can only get to negative 270.
Yeah.
However, by the virtue of humans and humans doing what humans do,
Yeah.
the coldest place in the entire universe is on Earth, because scientists have been able to make super extreme vacuums where they've been able to achieve temperatures or just fractions of a degree above absolute zero. So that to me is pretty incredible, that out of the entire universe, the coldest place in it is found
Was
on
in,
Earth.
in some
Relative
lab somewhere, just
knowledge.
a handful of people that made this, probably a little box. I don't know how big the actual chamber was, but I mean,
Yeah.
it is worth remembering that. I mean, that was a feat that humans did. And how did we do it? By making ideas about how to cool things down, about how to create vacuums, about how to, I think they like somehow use lasers to cool things down. I don't, it's all beyond me, but
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
somebody put an idea, and probably multiple people really put ideas out that then led to these discoveries, that then led to this. And so um, this knowledge base that humans have allowed us to do something that would not have happened on its own. It's a deliberate departure from the state of normal affairs in the universe that took place on this planet.
So there was one part in the first 3 chapters that I was a little bit confused on. Maybe not confused, but not entirely sold on. So
Right.
maybe you can help me out with that. So in chapter 3, he has like 2 big statements that he drops. One of which is that problems are inevitable.
Right.
In other words, like as you go down this path of knowledge, you're going to come up with problems, like things that don't make sense, things that don't work out. The more you learn, you kind of make more problems over time. But he follows it up with another big statement, which is problems are soluble.
Right.
So all our problems are soluble, is what he says, and that's kind of like the beginning of infinity, right? Like it's just the more you learn, the more problems you create. Every problem soluble. The more of those problems, the more problems you create. It's a self-propagating chain. But he also, the part I have trouble resolving is how that is consistent with. All right, let me back up. Like imagine like an ant or something. Like the ant has no idea that we exist, right? They have no idea what a human is. They have no idea what any of this is.
Speak for yourself. I'm good with the ants and they respect me.
Yeah, Jimmy the Ant-Man. But it's like there's just another level, like almost like another dimension of consciousness between us and the ant. Like how can we say that there's not an extra dimension of consciousness between us and another beings that we're just completely unaware of? And he says in one of the chapters, he says that we are not limited in knowledge in the sense that a chimpanzee cannot understand quantum physics. But I'm like, what if we are to the chimpanzees? Then why is there not another species that is of the same relationship to us?
Yeah. I think the answer there would basically be that because we have the ability to understand. So like right now, if our brain has some kind of shortcoming, nothing prevents us from making a technology that expands the power of our brain. And so then the process can continue. So whatever
But that's like
an
analytical improvement. It's not like a creative improvement.
Well, I think that it could be a creative improvement. I mean, it's hard to know until it actually happens. But I would say there's nothing that forbids us from, whether it's a limit of our brain size or brain power or speed of computation or whatever else it is, that nothing prevents us from understanding that problem, and then from that problem proposing solutions for why we couldn't improve it beyond whatever our current limitations may be.
Yeah, like well, what he was saying, that Edison came up with a phrase that something, or success is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration.
Right.
And he says that perspiration is achieved through computers.
Right.
But that 1% inspiration, how do we know that we as humans are not limited in that regard? In that metric?
And I think so. He later
perspiration
on,
is the easy part. I agree with that.
Right. That's the easy part. The hard part is the inspiration part. And so the argument would be something to the effect of, if we can make grounds on understanding what creativity is, that would in a sense be kind of the first step in understanding what creativity is. We could then understand the limitations that are imposed on it by, say the physical makeup of our brain, whatever that may be. And then we can improve those physical limitations. And nothing, in other words, the argument from David isn't the human brain as it currently exists can understand any and all phenomena with any and all precision. It's because we're on this path of improvement that there's nothing that eventually we couldn't figure out as we keep on providing better explanations based on previous explanations. And so if you can put yourself on that trajectory, then whatever problem you encounter is insoluble, because it would involve something taking place inside of a universe governed by laws of physics that we can further and further understand, and then further and further apply to whatever limitation we're encountering.
So like once a species obtains this ability of conjecture, then there are no limitations to the knowledge.
And criticism. You have to have, I guess it would be the culture in a sense between conjecture and criticism that allows you to improve. In other words, because I think this is an important part too. It isn't as if, we wouldn't make much progress, or certainly not very quickly, if we just made random guesses all the time and never did anything about the random guesses. We need a way of comparing. Exactly. We need a way of comparing them to the previous theory to see which one's actually better. And if we can show us some kind of improvement, then we can replace the old one with the new one. And so even though it's the beginning of infinity by definition, that you're always far from infinity, it's still progress. And I think that's an important key to that. It's on an infinite ladder, but you're still higher than the rung before you or below you. So you're climbing up, but you're always infinitely more to go. And so the premise is basically, anything that takes place inside of our universe is happening because it's allowed by the laws of physics, whatever they may be, because we're on a path as universal contractors of understanding what those rules are. There's no limitation that we cannot continue to further improve our understanding and application of those laws. Like in theory, we can make a star. I mean, we couldn't do that right now because we would have no way of assimilating enough mass and to do it. But I mean, we could. Nothing would prevent us from doing it in theory, because we understand how gravity and stars work.
It's within the laws of physics.
Exactly.
Yeah, he had another quote that was matter, energy, and evidence are the only requirements for open-ended knowledge creation.
I think he describes like a spaceship out that's like floating through space and like gathering hydrogen as it flies through to make. If people are listening to this, you could use hydrogen to build any other atom by just fusion. I mean, that's where all the atoms come from anyway. So you just use hydrogen to make helium, to make lithium, to make what's the fourth one, barium, or whatever it is, so on and so forth. And so even with most simple starting boron, I think you're right. Whatever the starting material is, given knowledge, energy, etc., you can literally build anything that is allowed inside of the universe.
It just takes energy, right?
And knowledge. And knowledge is really the key thing, because it allows, with knowledge, as we grow knowledge, we can apply our knowledge of how to. It's basically like an instruction manual. Okay, we now have knowledge of how to build a star. Now we can build one, given what you're saying, that we have sufficient energy in order to do so. But the knowledge is important too, because, and I think he makes this point, and related to other shows that talked about this book as well. But a common theme is that just having the knowledge isn't going to be necessarily enough, because you still need, there's like, if I told somebody on an island, here's what you need to do in order to build a airplane to fly the island, it's like, well, I don't have a lathe, so it's going to be hard for me to do that. Like, you need some material, but the knowledge is important as well, because with knowledge, you can actually, in some cases, produce the material that you need to then build what you need to then get off. It's always iterative. I mean, how did we build the first airplane? Eventually, we didn't have anything. We had sticks and stones. But through a process of knowledge, we were able to eventually build airplanes. So that's the lineage. That's the beginning of infinity.
Yeah, I like that. And then there's a Feynman quote in one of these chapters I really liked. I think it was in chapter 3, where Feynman was talking about, I don't know, humans in general. He said that we keep learning more about how not to fool ourselves.
Right.
And I thought that was real powerful, because that talks about like the process of improving things is like, back in the day, we would fool ourselves with these mythologies, with these dogmas, etc. And science is it's essentially just another definition for science, how to not fool ourselves. Yeah, I like that frame of looking at it.
I do too. And it immediately opens up the path for continuously improving, because we can always not fool ourselves better. There's always a shortcoming to whatever idea that we currently have. It can always be improved upon. And so as long as we're pursuing knowledge by making explanations, by testing explanations. Again, as long as we have the matter and energy to actually do it, then we are in good shape. And I think, I don't know what the chapter on optimism is. Is that maybe
Past chapter 3?
Past chapter 3. Does he define optimism in chapter 3 when he gives the problems are soluble, problems are inevitable?
I don't remember it.
So the definition, it builds off what you're talking about now. The definition he gives is that optimism states that all problems are caused by lack of knowledge. And it's interesting to think, why would that definition of optimism be consistent with his principle so far? And the argument would be something to the effect of, an optimist is somebody with a positive disposition towards the future. If you believe that all problems are soluble and that problems are inevitable, but also that problems are soluble, then an optimist would basically be somebody who believes that all evil stems from lack of knowledge, and that because we're universal constructors, we can continuously improve our knowledge and thus continuously erode whatever evil remains on this infinite, journey towards improvement. So interesting ideas. I think problems are inevitable. I definitely agree with problems are soluble. I would say from the basis of the universal constructor, it makes sense to me. The idea that all problems or that all evils come from lack of knowledge, that one I'm a little more hesitant on.
All evils?
All evils come from lack of knowledge. And I always think that's interesting. I kind of believe that, but I'm still thinking about it. That's where I'll leave that one for now. I'm still thinking about that one.
Well, let me, this might shed some light on that. He was talking about morality and arrogance in chapter 3. And he at one point said that morality is supposed to refer only to the internal organization of chemical scums. So in other words, he's just saying that in the grand scheme of the universe, morality doesn't really mean anything. It's just like this thing that humans kind of do.
Right.
And that, in fact, we didn't have enough arrogance like pre-enlightenment. And the reason he's saying that is that we weren't arrogant enough to assume that the world was fundamentally incomprehensible to them. Or in other words, they believed that the world wasn't fundamentally comprehensible, so they started making these solutions. But if they had a more arrogant approach, that would not be the case. But the bigger point is this whole idea of like morality, this whole idea of what is right and wrong, is just made up concepts by this chemical scum. Like they're in the grand scheme of things in the universe, there is no right or wrong. Like it's kind of a stupid question to ask someone, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this evil? Is this good? I'm not sure that there's any productivity in asking those types of questions.
I would disagree with that. I would say it's certainly true that to our sun, it's not, if we all blow ourselves to pieces, our sun's not gonna like take the day off or something. It doesn't really care about us. But I would say the thing is that even if only people care about it, to me that's enough. I mean, I care enough about humanity in a sense to care about what we all think as people. And so I don't need the moon to care about murder to know that we should care about murder. I would say that it's limited to us because we created it for sure, but that the moon doesn't care about it. I don't mean the moon doesn't care about anything. The moon isn't thinking, it's not caring. So I would say that our focus on morality, I think, should be focused on humans. And I don't know that we should worry that much about, and here I would agree with you, I don't know that we should worry that much about the idea of the universal perspective on what's happening on Earth. I think that we should care because it impacts us. I want to live in a world where murder isn't allowed. I benefit. I'm sure you agree with that. I like not being murdered every now and then. And so even if the moon doesn't care, I certainly do. And I think when we're talking about morality, again, this comes up later on in the book too, but even in that, in discussing ethics and morality, there is still a process in which we can apply making good explanations for things, and that it's good explanations that allow us to understand how one system of treating people can be improved upon through that process of conjecture and criticism. And so it is uniquely human in the sense that, animals don't really have morals that we do. But I don't know that diminishes its value because it's only for us anyways. We're not concerned with the moon's opinion on how we treat each other.
So I found this book, Beginning of Infinity, through Naval, as we've discussed before. And there's another author that Naval really likes. I think he's like a coach of Naval's or something. His name is Kapil Gupta. And he talks about this specifically in a lot of detail. And it's like, because he addresses like these questions that people ask a lot of times, like, is it right to give to the poor? Is it right to give to this homeless person? Is it right or wrong to work hard? Is it right or wrong to live not wrong, or not to live in a way like a sloth way?
Right.
He just rejects all these questions. He says that they're bad questions because there is no right or wrong. It's everyone's kind of built on their own path, and as long as you're on your path and you're seeking truth, like what is really right and what is not conceptualized by society, what is not a societal construct, it doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It doesn't matter if you work hard or not, because at the end of the day, you're programmed a certain way. You're going to get somewhere. And the sooner you realize your own personal truth and path, the better. It doesn't matter. Like, you can go up to some authority figure and be like, hey, is it right for me to be angry at this situation? It's like, it doesn't matter, because you're going to get angry at the situations you're going to get angry at. It's not up to you. And that's where the idea of right and wrong gets a little fuzzier. But I mean, you brought up a good example of like murder. Like, I think that's unambiguously wrong, or at least, and I don't know, is that a societal definition, or is it a construct? Is it not? I don't know. Those are
There's
pieces to piece together.
There's a good chapter in BOI where he talks about the reality of abstractions that I think gets to a lot of this. The idea that it's an idea, so it doesn't matter. And so, well, in a way, ideas do matter and they are real. It's like, if they weren't real, what would they be? It's real in a sense that we have the idea. And so what I would say is, there's a lot to unpack with the Naval teacher. Well, let me just kind of leave it with this. I think the most important thing anybody can do on a daily basis, that's not, it's the obvious, shit. Don't be a thief or a murderer. But I think more practical, more applicable is this idea of always being willing to criticize what you currently believe. Like, that is the place to start, right? And it isn't just enough to criticize, but also to always be looking for better explanations. And so, to me, that still puts you on the path that David Deutsch is talking about. And when I look at, the moment somebody becomes closed-minded to some kind of bigotry, like, that's in a sense, that's worse than just having the bigotry beforehand, because we probably all have bigotries of some sort or another. No one's born perfect. But if you teach yourself to have an open mind, then any bigotry that you have, there is potential for that to change through some kind of argument or through some kind of criticism. It's when you close that off that the problem really sets in, because now there's no hope that you ever change your mind. And so for me,
how is something like bigotry like testable, for example?
Yeah, well, so something like, let's say, the idea that what would be a good bigotry? Something like what would be? I'm trying to think of one that's not like in vogue right now. Something like
Labradors are the best kind of dog, or something.
That, or I was even thinking something more like there's a lot of ones to give. I'm trying to think of a good one. Something like, you can judge somebody based off of their parents or something like that. Like, oh, like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And you can test that by saying, well, do some bad parents have good kids? Yes. Oh, okay. So that idea can be improved by saying that we should just judge people based on their individual merits. You don't have to judge someone based off of their parents' mistakes. And so, that would be testable, because you could look and say, well, their dad was a murderer. Are they going to be a murderer? Well, there's no guarantee. We shouldn't just assume that they are. This is like the Minority Report, although it's a little bit different. But I would say, but that to me would be an important kind of bigotry to overcome. And that,
but it would be a spectrum, though, right? It wouldn't be like every single murderer parent would have a murderer child. Right. But maybe if you analyze 1,000 different murderer parents, you see a slight bias that the child will be a murderer.
Sure, but that would still improve upon the idea that it's guaranteed. So if your bigotry was that it's determined that bad parents only ever have bad kids, that idea could be improved upon. and in a testable way. And so I think those kind of ideas are important, because I mean, I would say a lot of history of morality is just learning to treat people as individuals. That was like a big improvement, and to the extent that we commit ourselves to that is good. And I would say that is an improvement, because it's testable basically. But and would also, I think, again, be a way of not just better in the sense of better theory, but also, treating somebody better. Like if I meet a kid whose parents were both in prison, and I treat him with respect versus not, that would be better. I'm not making an assumption. I'm not doing something along those lines. So I would say in those cases it is better, and you can make a judgment based off of the criteria in David Deutsch's book. Where I think it gets fuzzy is when you have people that are equally committed and is coming to different outcomes. But again, it's how committed are you to keeping an open mind? How committed are you to criticism, so on and so forth? I think you're on the right track. And I would say for most people, myself included, that's the harder challenge, is always committing yourself to an open mind, committing yourself to be wrong, accepting when you are wrong, improving the theory to be, to be better, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great framework to base things on. And I know that we're running low on time, but yeah, the interesting thing about this book is it is David Deutsch is a physicist, correct?
Right.
But it's kind of almost like a philosophical. What I like about it is it really helps you create framework for like what is knowable, like what knowledge is, like what is reasonable to believe, what is not reasonable to believe. I think that is super helpful for just forming your own psyche, for forming your own basis for comparing and looking at the world. So I think that's like what I like the most about this so far. And I mean, before we close out, I want to get your take on what you think. Let me rephrase that. Why do you think there's a cult following behind this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first and foremost, David is an exceptional writer. I think the book,
he's great.
If you consider what this book accomplishes, and yet it's written in a popular science format, by which I mean that the popular audience could read the book and understand it. You don't have to have a PhD to understand this book. That is an impressive feat, and I think just the writing alone warrants that following. I think the style the book is written in, where he has a summary and vocabulary and terminology, is always nice. I think the style is important, but most importantly, I think the message is one that is inspiring in a legitimate way. It isn't inspiring in the sense that the world is whatever you want it to be, and that's, there's no fantasy in a sense with this book. It's inspiring, but in a legitimate way that actually makes sense. And I think an inspiring and legitimate message is extremely important right now. We face a lot of problems, and nobody doubts that. And to have somebody come along and say, yes, true, but we can figure them out, that is important to hear. And I would say the most important takeaway from Beginning of Infinity is that it really sets up a way for humans to engage in a long-term culture of escaping zero-sum situations. That we can always grow, we can always improve, we can always spread, whether that be knowledge or wealth or just the number of people. There's no limit. There's the sky is the limit, in the sense that there's nowhere to go. There's everywhere to go. And so I think that is a unique message right now, actually. And I think it's also the true message. I think it's also the correct message. And I think that as time goes on, my hope is that more people take this book seriously and think, you know what, this actually is a framework for long-term success. We actually can do this. And it doesn't require anything fantastical or anything mystical. It's just paying attention to what we've already been doing and committing ourselves to continuing the best parts of that tradition. That's all that's required. And so for the people who read this book and take away that message, it's a very hard message to walk away from. It's a really hard message to turn your back on once you've been exposed to it. So I think it's a good message. I agree with it. And my hope is that other people who read this book will also come to agree with the message as well.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree with that.
Let's give our album of the week. We're doing our new thing where we have somebody read it off air. So, but the album people can look forward to this week is going to be Random Access Memories by Daft Punk, which I would argue, Joe, is an appropriate album of the week for this one because it's kind of, space age and techno and, technology and that kind of thing. So it's a nice album in your opinion. It's a very nice fit for our opening discussion of the beginning of Infinity. And also a social media shout out, also, appropriate for the context of what we're talking about, is Jonny Kim, who Joel and I have talked about on the podcast before. This is, Captain America. I mean, this guy, Navy SEAL astronaut doctor. I mean, that's ridiculous. Talk about, we're all beginning on Infinity. Jonny Kim's a little bit further along than the rest of us. We all got a long way to go. Jonny Kim a little bit closer, I think, just a little, just a smidgen closer. So our shout out goes to him for, in a sense, being kind of a living example of somebody who was taking on the challenge of, I would say, always improving. I mean, that goes without saying, but seems very committed in a way to a message. Through his actions, I don't know him, obviously I don't know him, but it seems anybody that's dedicating themselves to these kind of missions believes in some kind of long-term success for humanity. And for that reason, I think it's an appropriate shout out for this week's social media shout out.
Great. Yeah. Like you said, incredible person. Like most people don't even achieve one of those things in their lifetimes. And he's done 3 and he's like, what, 30?
30. And he's also good looking. So I don't even know where where's the justice? I don't know. Yeah, very impressive. He's been on a number of shows, maybe one down this one, but always a treat to listen to, and just what a guy, Jonny Kim. Shout out goes to you. And album of the week, Random Access Memories by Daft Punk. Closing thoughts, Joe, before we close out the episode.
I thought this was a good conversation on this book. I think that there's going to be a lot more to come from it. I think we opened a lot of threads that we might need to revisit in future episodes. Sure. And I still got like 300 pages left of the book, so I'm excited.
Yes. For anybody who wants a very in-depth chapter by chapter analysis of this book, check out Brett Hall. We talked about Brett Hall last time. I watched Brett Hall before this episode. Undoubtedly, some of the things that he said, I'm just repeating right now, though, no doubt about it. So check out Brett Hall. Great show on this book. And then also, I came across another podcast. I think there are a few more to talk about this book, but I actually listened to this one, and they're called Made You Think, the Made You Think podcast. And I didn't agree with all their takeaways from the book or all of the kind of the analogies or examples that they gave, but it was a good discussion nonetheless. And I listened to them, and so undoubtedly some of their ideas are making their way on this episode as well. And but if you want to hear more discussion about the book, and again, I would say, Brett Hall, that chapter by chapter analysis, be sure to check out his channel and also the Made You Think podcast as well. But yeah. I think that will do it, Joe, unless you want to add anything else.
Yeah, big thanks to Brett. He's been a big inspiration for this process. Yeah. So got to give him a shout out.
Got you. Got to get it on. All right, everybody. Well, that was a fun one. Thank you for joining us. Follow us on Twitter at @Roses_Rhetoric. The website, www.rosesinrhetoric.com. Follow Joe on Instagram and Twitter at Jose4_Cuervo. And also Rose Rhetoric has run Instagram as well, which is also Roses_Rhetoric. So follow us, like, share, subscribe, you know the deal. We will see you next time.